Welcome back to another guestless episode where I'm reading The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist. Chapter 5, The Primacy of the Right Hemisphere. If the two hemispheres produce two worlds, which should we trust if we are after the truth about the world? Do we simply accept that there are two versions of the world that are equally valid and go away shrugging our shoulders? I believe that the relationship between the hemispheres is not equal, and that while both contribute to our knowledge of the world, which therefore needs to be synthesized, one hemisphere, the right hemisphere, has precedence in that it underwrites the knowledge that the other comes to have, and is alone able to synthesize the world, what we both know, into a usable whole. In this chapter, I'll explain why I believe that to be the case. We might be persuaded by the fact that the left hemisphere provides a detailed and precise picture to suppose that it, rather than its irritatingly imprecise counterpart, gives us the truth about the world, and its less engaged stance might be a clue that it is more trustworthy. However, the fact that disengaged attention is in some cases psychopathic tells us that the question has meaning for the value, including the moral value of the world we experience. It's an important question to decide, but there is a problem in reaching a conclusion here. Each hemisphere attends in a different way. Different ways of attending produce different realities, including about this question of the hemisphere difference, how to break out of the hermeneutic cycle. One way of approaching the question would be to look at the results, to compare the results of adopting a more detached kind of attention to the world with results of adopting a more engaged kind. Towards the end of this book, I will do just that. Look at how the assumption that the world is best understood according to the left hemisphere's take, as a mechanism, compares with the assumption that the world is more like a living thing, a connected whole, as a right hemisphere would see it. I will do so without any special pleading, judging the answer according to the values of the left hemisphere, not those of the right. We can, after all, measure the consequences of the way we look at the world by what happens to it and what happens to us. However, since attention alters us as well as what we attend to, the very judgment we made might reflect not so much on reality as the nature of who we had become or were becoming. It seems hard to step outside this problem, which raises another circularity. This is why the last chapter looked for indications from philosophy. I began by suggesting that there might be some clues from physics, the other path by which we try to apprehend ultimate reality. If it is indeed another path and not the same path in another light, there is a tendency for the life sciences to consider a mechanistic universe more real, even though physics long ago moved away from this legacy of the 19th century materialism, with the rather odd result that the inanimate universe has come to appear animate, to take part in the mind, while the animate universe appears inanimate, mindless. Science has to prioritize clarity, detached, narrowly focused attention, the knowledge of things as built up from parts, sequential analytical logic as a path to knowledge, and the prioritizing of detail over the bigger picture. Like philosophy, it comes at the world from the left hemisphere's point of view, and the left hemisphere's version of reality works well at the local level, the everyday on which we are focused by habit. They're Newtonian mechanics rules, but if it frays at the edges, once one pans out to get the bigger picture of reality, the subatomic or at the cosmic level, here, uncertainty replaces certainty. The fix turns out to be constantly changing and cannot be pinned down. Straight lines are curved, in other words. Einstein's laws account better than Newton's. Straight lines, such as the horizon, are curved if one takes a longer view, and space itself is curved, so that the rectilinearity of the left hemisphere is a bit like that flat earther's view. That's the way it looks here and now. I would say that the shape, not just of space and time, but of our apprehension of them, is curved, beginning in the right hemisphere, passing through the realm of the left hemisphere somewhere in the middle, and returning to that of the right hemisphere. Reality has a roundness rather than a rectilinearity, a theme I will return to at the end of the book. In the last chapter, I pointed to the fact that in the 20th century, despite the nature of the philosophical process, themes emerge from philosophical debate which, unknowingly, corroborate the right hemisphere's understanding of the world. These include empathy and intersubjectivity as a ground of consciousness, the importance of an open, patient attention to the world, as opposed to a willful, grasping attention, the implicit or hidden nature of truth, the emphasis on the process rather than stasis, the journey being more important than the arrival, the primacy of perception, the importance of the body in constituting reality, an emphasis on uniqueness, the objectifying nature of vision, the irreducibility of all value to utility, and creativity as an unveiling, no saying process rather than a willfully constructing process. Wittgenstein spoke of an experience that was for him a paradigm of the sense of the ultimate value, the sense of wonder at the very existence of the world itself. Heidegger said that what we call the pre-Socratic philosophers were not philosophers, but thinkers, who had no need of philosophy, caught up as they were in the radical astonishment of being. For Plato, the sense of wonder is the mark of the philosopher. Philosophy indeed has no other origin. In fact, he thought that the theos phobos, brackets sacred fear, was so profoundly moving and life-altering that the arts, which could summon it up, ought to be, page turn, under strict censorship to preserve public order. Aristotle wrote that it is owing to their wonder that men both now begin and at first began to philosophize. But already, Democritus, a contemporary of Plato, starts to praise athaumastasia and athambia, a refusal to be moved or amazed by anything. The Stoic sages regard it as their highest aim to not lose their composure. And Cicero, as well as Horace, commends the nil admirari, to be astonished at nothing. The mark of the true philosopher becomes not the capacity to see things as they are, and therefore to be awestruck by the fact of being, but precisely the opposite, to keep cool in the face of existence, to systematize and clarify the world, so that it is represented as an object of knowledge. The role of the philosopher, as of the scientist, becomes to demystify, which we don't love. Mystique be cool. That wasn't cool. The sense of awe which motivates philosophy was, however, not lost. Even Descartes held that wonder is the first of all of the passions. But it has also been perceived by many that wonder was not just the origin, but the aim of philosophy. Thus, to Goethe, it was the highest that man can attain. Wittgenstein saw greater wisdom in mythic than in scientific accounts of the world, which leaves us with the distinct impression that everything has been accounted for. They give us the illusion of explaining a world that we might do better to wonder at. Wittgenstein criticizes explanation in order to make way for wonder. Clarity for him was largely in the service of awe. His critical energies were directed at unmasking what he saw as the pseudo-explanations that tend to become between us and the world, blinding us to the sheer wonder of its existence. Similarly, Thomas Nagel writes, certain forms of perplexity, for example, about freedom, knowledge, and the meaning of life, seem to me to embody more insight than any of the supposed solutions to those problems. And most recently, Arne Naes put in these words, philosophy begins and ends with wondering, profound wondering. It is this that the 20th century philosophy painstakingly regained. Philosophy shares the trajectory that I have described as typical of the relationship between the hemispheres. It begins in wonder, intuition, ambiguity, puzzlement, and uncertainty. It progresses through being unpacked, inspected from all angles, and wrestled into linearity by the left hemisphere. But its endpoint is to see that the very business of language and linearity must themselves be transcended and once more left behind. The progression is familiar from the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere again. This would also be in keeping with other evidence for the primary role of the right hemisphere in yielding the experiential world. Further evidence of the primary role of the right hemisphere. In fact, we have already touched on a number of reasons for supposing that the right hemisphere plays a primary grounding role in the relationship between the hemispheres. There is a primacy of broad vigilant attention. Though focused attention may appear to its owner to be under conscious control, in reality it is already spoken for. We direct attention according to what we are aware of. And for that we need broad, right hemisphere attention. Then there is a primacy of wholeness. The right hemisphere deals with the world before separation, division, analysis has transformed it into something else, before the left hemisphere has represented it. It is not that the right hemisphere connects, because what it reveals was never separated. It does not synthesize. What was never broken down into parts, it does not need to integrate. What was never less than whole. We've also looked at the role of the right hemisphere plays in delivering what is new, its primacy of experience. What we know had to come into being first for the right hemisphere, since by definition, at first it is new. The right hemisphere delivers what is new as it presents it, before the left hemisphere gets to represent it. And we have the fact that the left hemisphere's most powerful tool, referential language, has its origins in the body of the right hemisphere, a sort of primacy of means. I'd like to now look at some further lines of evidence on the matter. Yes. The primacy of the implicit. The origins of language in music and the body could be seen as part of a bigger picture, part of the primacy of the implicit. Metaphor, subserved by the right hemisphere, comes before denotation, subserved by the left. This is both a historical and epistemological truth. Metaphorical meaning is in every sense prior to abstraction and explicitness. The very words tell us this. One cannot draw something away unless there is something to draw it away from. One cannot fold something and make it explicit unless it is already folded. One cannot unfold something and make it explicit unless it is already folded. The roots of explicitness lies in the implicit. As Lichtenberg said, most of our expressions are metaphorical. The philosophy of our forefathers lies hidden in them. Metaphor is not just a reflection of what has been, however, but the means whereby the truly new, rather than just a novel, may come about. When a metaphor actually lives in the mind, it can generate new thoughts or understanding. It is cognitively real and active, not just a dead historical remnant of a once-lived metaphor, a cliché. All understanding, whether of the world or even of ourselves, depends on choosing the right metaphor. The metaphor we choose governs what we see. Even in talking about understanding, we can't escape metaphors. Grasping things, for example, won't get us as far as we would like, because the most important thing in life refuses to be grasped in either sense. Like Tantalus grapes, they retreat from the reaching hand. The paradox of philosophy is that we need to get beyond what can be grasped or explicitly stated. But the drift of philosophy is always and inevitably back towards the explicit. Merleau-Ponty, Heidegger, Scheller, and the later Wittgenstein perceive that explicitness ties us down to what we already know, however much we carry on unfolding and unfolding. Implicitly, and at times explicitly, each of them try to take philosophy beyond the explicit, therefore in one sense beyond itself. In doing so, they illuminated the limits of analytical language, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must remain silent. But the attempt still is worth making, indeed has to be made, and always will, provide only that one respects the limits to what can be achieved. For an old psychologist and Pied Piper like me, wrote Nietzsche, only too aware of the problems of language. Precisely that which would like to stay silent has to become audible. These philosophers' writings are replete with metaphorical images which only embody but themselves express implicitness. Thus, perhaps echoing Heidegger's circuitous path through the fields, Wittgenstein speaks of philosophy inquiry as not an explicit statement, but a series of perspectives, like a number of discrete walks across a mountain range which will, perhaps, allow an idea of the whole to emerge. 300 years before either Heidegger or Wittgenstein, Donne had written, "On a huge hill and steep truth stands, and he that will reach her about must go." I have no idea what that means. Perhaps it is fitting that a poet should have got there first. This circular, or more accurately, spiral-like progress is, again, very suggestive. The biggest problem of explicitness, however, is that it returns us to what we already know. It reduces a unique experience, person, or thing to a bunch of abstracted, therefore central concepts that we could have found already anywhere else. and indeed had already. Knowing, in a sense of seeing clearly, is always seeing as a something already known, and therefore not present but represented. Fruitful ambiguity is forced into being one thing or another. I started this chapter by suggesting that, because of its power to change, attention can also destroy. Many things that are important to us simply cannot withstand being too closely attended to, since their nature is to be indirect or implicit. Forcing them into explicitness changes their nature completely, so that in such cases that we come to think we know certainty is in fact not truly known at all. Too much self-awareness destroys not just spontaneity, but the quality that makes things live. The performance of music or dance, of courtship, love and sexual behavior, humor, artistic creation, and religious devotion become mechanical, lifeless, and may grind to a halt if we are too self-aware. Those things that cannot sustain the focus of conscious attention are often the same things which cannot be willed, that come only as a byproduct of something else. They shrink from the glare of the left hemisphere's world. Some things, like sleep, simply cannot be willed. The frame of mind required to strive for them is incompatible with the frame of mind that permits them to be experienced. As Montaigne wrote, "Even things I do easily and naturally, I cannot do once I order myself to do them with an expressed and prescribed command. The very parts of my body which have a degree of freedom and autonomy sometimes to refuse to obey me if I plan to bind them to obligatory service at a certain time and place." What's true of making love and going to sleep is also true of things less physical. For example, attempts to be natural, to love, to be wise, or to be innocent and self-unseeing are self-defeating. The best things in life hide from the full glare of the focused attention. They refuse our will. It is, however, precisely the left hemisphere's task to bring things into focus, to render the implicit explicit, in order that what is seen may become the object of our will. This is achieved by a certain kind of vision, since only vision of all human senses can give truly detailed information and give clear pinpointing into space to guide our grasp. This clarity and fixity of the object is highly amendable to the world view of the left hemisphere. In fact, it is only the case in the left hemisphere, not of the right, that one can speak appropriately of the world view at all. But sight alone of all the senses allows finely discriminate depth. As long as the depth is preserved, it yields for the right hemisphere's engagement. Betweenness shorn away, it allows precision focusing by the left hemisphere, a point in a two-dimensional plane. One is aware of this two-dimensional particularity when focusing a microscope or telescope. The resulting illusion is of clarity, the ability to know something just as it is, as though everything about it were revealed through clear vision. Depth is the sense of something lying beyond. Another way of thinking of this would be more generally in terms of the ultimate importance of context. Context is that something, in reality nothing less than a world, in which whatever is seen inheres, and in which its being lies, and in reference to which alone it can be understood, lying both beyond and around it. The problem with attentional spotlight, as conventional psychological literature calls it, is that this isolates the object of attention from its context, not just its surroundings, but the depth in which it lives. It opacifies it. Our vision stops at the thing itself. The price is that this shearing away of the context produces something lifeless and mechanical. In a famous passage in the Meditations, Descartes speaks of looking from a window and seeing men pass in the street. Yet, he reflects, do I see any more than hats and coats, which could conceal automatons? I judge that they are men. It is not surprising that, shorn by the philosophic stare of all context that might give them meaning, the coats and hats that Descartes sees from his window walking about in the street could be animated by a machine. They have become fully opaque. The observer no longer passes through them to see the living person beneath. He no longer sees what is implied. However, the attention of the right hemisphere, concerned as it is with the being in context, permits us to see through them to the reality that lies around and beyond them. It could not make the mistake of seeing the clothes and hats in isolation. The illusion that, if we can see something clearly, we see it as it really is hugely seductive. Ruskin, in Modern Painters, makes the point that clarity is bought at the price of limitation. We never see anything clearly. What we call seeing a thing clearly is only seeing enough of it to make out what it is. This point of intelligibility varying in distance for different magnitudes and kinds of things. He gives the example of an open book and an embroidered handkerchief on a lawn. Viewed from a distance of 1/4 of a mile, they are indistinguishable. From closer we can see which is which, but not read the book or trace of embroidery on the handkerchief. As we go nearer, we can now read the text and trace of the embroidery, but cannot see the fibers of the paper, nor the threads of the stuff. Closer still, and we can see the watermark in the threads, but not the hills and the dales in the paper's surface, nor the fine fibers which shoot off from every thread, until we take a microscope to it, and so on, ad infinitum. At which point do we see it clearly? When, therefore, we say, we see the book clearly, Ruskin concludes, we mean only that we know it as a book. Clarity, it seems, describes not a degree of perception, but a type of knowledge. To know something clearly is to know it partially only, and to know it rather than to experience it in a certain way. With the beginnings of modernity, our experience itself becomes increasingly pictorial. As Heidegger writes, the world's picture does not change from an earlier one into a modern one, but rather the fact that the world becomes a picture at all is what distinguishes the essence of the modern age. This changes the nature of existence. Where the world becomes a picture, the world is conceived and grasped as a picture. What is, in its entirety, is now taken in such a way that it is first in being, and it is only in being to the extent that it is set up by man, who represents it and sets forth. Heidegger's animus was directed particularly against the impact of Descartes, who had written that the conduct of our life depends entirely on our senses, and sight is the noblest and most comprehensive of them. This is precisely because Descartes was concerned with vision as an instrument of clear, sharply defined knowledge of each thing in isolation, a project impossible to reconcile with understanding based on the implicit, context-bound nature of things, as delivered by the right hemisphere, which the left hemisphere only subsequently represents them and sets forth as distinct items. It is not by chance that the word distinct implies division. In order to truly see the thing as it is, attention needs to do something quite different. It needs both to rest on the object and pass through the plane of focus. Seeing the thing as it is depends on also seeing through it, to something beyond, the context, the roundness or depth in which it exists. If the detached, highly focused attention of the left hemisphere is brought to bear on living things, and not later resolved into the whole picture by the right hemisphere attention, which yields depth and context, it is destructive. We become like insects, as Merleau-Ponty says. It is similar with works of art, which, as I have said, more in common with people than things. Explicitness always forces this shearing away, this concentration on the surface, and the loss of transparency, or more correctly, semi-transparency. It is the analogue of the joke explained, the metaphor laboriously restated. In such circumstances, the mechanism of the joke, of the metaphor, becomes opaque and obtrudes. Metaphoric meaning depends on this semi-transparency, this being seen and not being seen. Carenier writes of Homeric symbols, for example, that they can be seen through as a visible sign of an invisible order, not as an element of symbolism, but as a transparent part of the world. If they are obtruded as symbols, they would need to be explicitly decoded, and that would rob them of all their power. Making things explicit is the equivalent of focusing on the workings at the expense of the work, the medium at the expense of the message. Once opaque, the plane of attention is in the wrong place, as if we focus on the mechanics of the play, not on the substance of the play itself, or on the plane of the canvas, not what is seen there. Depth, as opposed to distance from a surface, never implies detachment. Depth brings us into a relationship, whatever the distance involved, with the other, and allows us to feel across the intervening space. It situates us in the same world as the other. Thus, however distant the figures in a Claude painting, we feel drawn to them and their world. We are taken on a journey into the depth of space that surrounds them. As Hazlitt said, Diderot wrote a series of descriptions of 7 walks he had taken with a certain abbé for his companion through the most beautiful wild scenery, and what they had seen and experienced there. Only at the end does he reveal that these were imagined travels within the landscape of Venet's paintings. What produces alienation is not depth, but lack of depth. Loss of depth forms an important feature of the Cartesian objective view of the world, as if it were projected on the surface of the retina or on the photographic plate. We are rebuffed by the two-dimensionality of the plane that stands some distance from us. Without depth, a two-dimensional world in which we can no longer stand alongside what becomes the object of our vision. Depth is of great psychological significance, and it is relevant that in schizophrenia, which simulates an overactive left hemispheric state, there is a, as Louis Sass has shown, perspectival slippage, a loss of grip on the frame of reference. Attention ceases to be paid to, say, the scene pictured on the paper and is transferred to the plane of the paper itself. There is a loss of precisely the transparency that operates when we understand something in a normal way. A painting. A painting is not a thing in the world, nor is it just a representation of the world. In a marvelous phrase of Merleau-Ponty's, we do not see paintings as much as we see according to them. They are, like people and the forms of the natural world, neither just objective things nor mere representations of things. They permit us to see through and according to themselves. They have a semi-opaque or semi-transparent quality, not disappearing altogether, in which case some reality or other would be seen in their place, a reality which they would no more than represent. No, they have reality of their own. But equally, they are not mere things existing out there, independent of us or whatever else it is that exists. We are aware of them, but we see through them, see the world according to them. To take the example of Claude painting, we never allow our eyes simply to rest on the pure thing in front of us, a canvas measuring such and such, with so and so patch of blue and green and brown on it, nor do we see straight through it, as though ignorant that we are looking at a painting and imagining we look through a window. Equally with poetry, language does not often function as if it were transparent. When we are reading a piece of prose and unaware of its factity, but in poetry the language itself is present to us, semi-transparent, semi-opaque, not a thing but a living something that allows us to move through it and beyond, though never allowing the language to disappear as though it played no part in whatever it is beyond language that it yields to us. Drama too can either be completely absorbing or quite alienating, becoming a picture in which we do not participate. In order to absorb, the medium has to be translucent or transparent. We must not focus on the players or the playwright. Shakespeare completely disappears in his work. That's why bad acting can be so embarrassing. It draws our attention to the fact that the actors are acting and to how they see themselves. They become like critics of those self-preening causes them to obtrude between us and what they claim to illuminate. The implicit becomes explicit and is lost. That one got me really tired. Hope you enjoyed. And peace. I'll see you on the next one.